Hello and welcome to the next Glyphs screencast video in this Glyphs tutorial series for YSDN 3003 typeface design. So picking up from where we left off in the last video where we were drawing Bezier letter forms, what I want to do in this video is talk about and demonstrate working with interpolation. So remember that in our last video we were talking about drawing letter forms. We didn't talk about in that last video about designing our letter forms to work within, let's say, what we'll call it interpolation space. Because remember that with a variable font, what we're working with is we're actually developing our typeface as a unit to work inside a continuous design space. So in doing that, we have to design for that technological capability or that technological fact, how that technology would work. And the way that variable fonts work is they're built on a tool that's been around for almost 50 years, maybe not 50, around 40 years technically, since around the 1970s, early 1970s, but in more recent digital typography context, it's been around since the mid to late 1980s. At Adobe and Apple, respectively, they developed their own kinds of file formats that you could perform interpolation with, and they essentially were issuing variable font type files. Not exactly the same, although the Apple GX TrueType format was quite similar to what we have with variable fonts today. Except, of course, OpenType variable fonts are different because they have the capabilities of OpenType features. They're working with quadratic Bezier curves, but largely they're very much the same. The difference is the platform and the environment that the typeface file is being implemented into. Whereas before it was a static world, a world of print, where you, of course, could use variable fonts to do the multiple master and GX fonts from the early 1990s, late 80s, you could have used them to great extent. However, the business benefit was not very large, and even the design benefit was not that large, or there were not as many opportunities back then because you're working in a print environment. Now let's say in a marketplace that's dominated by non-static typographic implementations, you don't need, you do need to have a file that has the capability of having many fonts within that one file. So we're just simply in a different time where the business of design has changed, but even more importantly, the business of how type is used and where it needs to be used has changed. And I think we'll see in the course as we go along the capabilities of how a variable font allows the tool, a font that is the tool, to interface with hardware and software, offers a huge benefit in the functionality of reading in general and accessibility. So let's look at how we're going to work with multiple master interpolation. So when I say multiple master interpolation, that is a name that's taken from the Adobe multiple master technology. However, the Adobe technology was scrapped by the mid-90s. It was no longer being managed at all by Adobe. They basically scrapped it, or shelved it, however you want to put it. But what ended up happening, though, is that was an end-user implementation. What font designers and type developers, type companies started to realize is that actually this multiple master technology is a really great way for us to build large type families. And to use that by working with more than one master. So multiple master just means more than one master. In a variable font, technically, remember up here I have two masters in this font. I'm just picking up from the font that we worked on in the last video. If I go to font info, you have to have at least two masters to do any kind of multiple master work. And right now with two masters here, I can interpolate between these two masters Right now I have regular 400 and bold 600. For the sake of demonstration for what I'll do today, I'll put this at 100, and I'll put this at 9, or maybe 200 and 900. 200 for regular, 900 for bold, and that will be enough for today. But we can actually interpolate between these two. And we're going to look at doing something called adding instances, which we'll do after we actually work with this. But one of the most important things that you need to know about multiple master interpolation, we're just going to use the N for now. One of the most important things that you do need to know about multiple master interpolation spaces is that you have to draw everything that you're actually expecting to be interpolated between. So I need to have a regular or a thin or a light version of an N, and I also have to draw the bold version, so the far extremity. Think of it as a line segment. I need to draw, excuse me, I just need a drink of water. You need to draw both extremities of the line segment, and then what you're doing is you're allowing the software, which right now is Glyphs, to interpolate steps in between. And we define those steps if we're doing a static output of a multiple master font. However, in a variable font, we have access to the entire continuous line segment. Okay, so first things first, what we need to do is in each of our masters, we need to have a drawing in each of them. Notice how you see a red bar on the top of the glyph. Every glyph in this font right now will have a red bar or a red tab beside it because it does not have a drawing inside that glyph. However, if I want, what I can do, very easy, I can just copy and paste this regular N into this glyph, and now there's no error message anymore. And if I go back into the font window, there's no error message. And that's because the same amount of points and type of points are being used, and the same starting points are being used in both masters. What's very important about an interpolation space is that you have to have the exact number of points. So if I select Command All and I look down here, so this represents the number of nodes, this represents the number of selected nodes. So that's the number of nodes inside the font. I could just click on one. Yeah, I have to select everything. I have 31 nodes. In the bold, I have 31 as well. That number has to match. But also, I have to have the same number of handlebars too. So if I was to delete this, it's showing an error. And by the way, to show what you're seeing on my screen, which are the blue and the green, and the error message, you have to go Show Master Compatibility and click that on. What I'm going to do is undo that. So if I add an extra point on a master, no, it doesn't like that. I can't do that. So I have to be working with the same amount of points on the outline, and if this outline is merged, same idea. It can't be merged in this one. So they have to be the same. They could both be merged, or they could both not be merged, like this, in two shape groups, but they have to be merged. By the way, a little note about drawing Bezier outlines. It's really handy to have your shapes in groups like this, because if I need to do any kind of editing to this branch stroke and this shoulder stroke in isolation of this stroke, I need to have my outlines being separated so that I can make the change without affecting this in here. That's really important, because if this was merged, and let's say that I tried grabbing all of this, well, not that serif, and move this, it's going to make the stem move like that. Another trick that you can use is to do something called open corner. So if I have a merge shape and I go open corner, right click, when I've selected these nodes, it opens up that corner and allows me to edit these curves again. So that's okay. That's something you can do. I just think that it's easier to leave them as parts in the working file for now, until we're ready to make the final file. Okay, so drawing bold, that's something that's important. In fact, well, what we're going to do is we're going to make an interpolation space between two masters. Then, in a variable font for weight, I would probably want to go and draw the lightweight. We'll add that later. but we're going to do this first. So drawing a bold, what I do is I select all, make Command J a mask in the background. Okay. And what I need to do, so I'm going to make this fairly bold. I'm going to make it, like, let's call it a super bold or something. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go selected everything, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then on this side, notice I'm only grabbing these points. These serifs are going to clash, but don't worry, we'll fix it after. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. By the way, as a refresher, I'm holding Shift and using the arrow keys. That's getting awfully bold. I'm going to go one more in each direction to make it 60 units from where regular was in the counter. And on the top, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I might not have to go as much, but I'll have to obviously edit this. Here's another trick for drawing. Okay, Option. Notice if I just move this node with just the arrow keys or Shift arrow keys, I'm moving the node and the handlebars at the same time. If I hold Option and Shift, watch what happens. I move the point, but the handlebars stay the same. And this works out really nicely because when I'm drawing a curve, just like remember, we made sure that we were having the same mathematical values for these BCP handlebars. When I'm drawing a curve, I more or less want these points to be somewhere in the middle area on either side of a handlebar. When you start getting stuff like this, whoops, if you start getting stuff like this, it's going to be very hard to get a nice smooth curve. The only time you would do something like this where the distribution of the handlebars are kind of lopsided is if you had a really tight curve that you were trying to construct. But I would say in the most part you want it to be centered, more or less centered. So that's what I'm doing right here. And I am going to have to adjust this. And that's going to adjust now when I expand the outside edge. So then I'm going to go, I did 60 on the inside. I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm making this really bold, mostly for the sake of demo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And the serifs are going to have to get larger. 1, 2. Let's make them only that bold. Let's make them 20. 1, 2. And we're going to make the angles go in the similar progression. Notice how I'm using the mask in the background there to follow the same progression. And I want this to cut down. Actually, no, I'm going to keep it up. Alright, now we need to there needs to be something that we do with these serifs. And you're going to see, because we have to make these kind of modifications on the serifs, some weird stuff happens when I start actually having to interpolate. We'll see that afterwards. So, and center that. Okay. All right, now I've expanded this, and what I want to do is I want to make this curve be similar to this curve that I was working with. Now, when I'm working on a variable font, what I like to do is I like to have all the masters open at the same time. Remember in this file that I was working on, it closed down, but I have 6 masters. What I like to do is when I'm working across the design space, on each character, I like to have all of these these masters open so that I can edit them in conjunction with one another, because I want a continuous harmony from the light to the very bold, from the condensed to the extended. So I want there to be a rhythm and a harmony between these shapes. So this is a great method for editing them. And obviously, for the most part, you guys will be working with only 2 masters largely, because it's a lot easier. But what I would do is I would have the regular open beside the super bold, because we want to edit these in conjunction with one another. And I want to make sure that the curves make sense, etc. So what I'm doing here now is I'm going to see if I can get this with the time. I don't want to take too long here, but I'm going to try to more or less get this to feel like it's synced up with that regular N. So by drawing with these together, it allows me to edit this design space and keep an eye on what's going on. Now you might say to yourself, okay, this gets really bold in here and this is quite thin. That's true, and so what I can try to do is I can see if I bring these tight together, this is where things do get a little bit to be, they get quite challenging because I'm working with such a kind of tight area. I'm running out of counter space. That's the tough thing about doing any kind of bold design work. You'll notice in this font that I'm showing you constantly here that I'm working on, look at how different this super bold letter becomes from this one. That's why I needed an intermediate bold master. I can't just interpolate between these two. Very weird things will happen if we do that. We could even do a demo of something like that to see what happens. Okay. And we're going to call it good right now. All right. For now, that's fine. All right, let's do an interpolation. What we can do to interpolate, we've got our values already. So remember, it's very important. Your whatever your chosen axis coordinate parameter is, weight, width, optical size, a custom parameter, you have to make sure that the one master has a different value here than the other one, or else nothing will happen. And they have to be far enough away from each other so that something will actually happen. So now there's quite a large distance. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to run something to show us. This is a script that we're going to download. I will show you in another video, or I'll show you in class. OpenType Variations Player. You don't necessarily need this script. Some students, in fact, my classes in the past have had trouble downloading this script. So I have another technique anyways for testing out your interpolation space. Apologies for the script freezing. We'll have to just wait for it. Okay, there we go. Now, we see two letters down here, but what we're actually going to do is we're going to see it play an interpolation. And I think it's playing very slow, probably because of the way it's running on the video. What this is actually doing is it's playing a sequence. Yeah, it's playing really slow because I've got an old MacBook and it's trying to run the video and record this. But you see that it's actually progressing between the regular version and the bold version. And actually this interpolation is working out pretty well, I will say. What I'm concerned about is what's going on between these serifs, because in the bold weight we probably don't want it to look, well, you know what, it's actually working quite well. There can be issues with this, but this one's working out. So I'm going to close that. Now what we can also do, if we were working in a static multiple master environment, I would create instances between regular and bold. So if you think about what that could mean, in fact, I'm going to call this ultra bold now. What I could create between, let's say, ultra bold, which is my super bold, and what I could create between regular would be medium, semi-bold, bold, even something like extra bold and then ultra bold. I could technically get that. So the way that I would do that is I would go over to instances. Now, a variable font, I think it should have instances in it for the end user, because it's not about the fact that just because we are giving them access to the entire design space, we don't need to maybe give them anything other than the masters, because they can interpolate and choose, you know, they can choose an arbitrary instance of 834. However, we have to think about the conventional way that people use fonts. People are very used to using typefaces that have the option of a semi-bold or a medium, so we have to make that available. So in order to do that, what I do is I go to instances, and the first thing I do is add instance for each master, and then it will give me instances. Now, these are different than the variable font masters, so these masters we're working off. The masters are the actual drawings that we're working on. Instances are generated steps along the continuum between these two masters, or even more masters than that. So what I can do then is I can do stuff like this. I can add an instance, and let's call this instance medium. And I need to go to weight and say medium because it needs to give it a different tag. This number tag corresponds, and I need to give ultra bold. Let's give it heavy, 900. These values are very important in the font menu for the typeface for applications like InDesign or TextEdit, Word, etc., being able to recognize different weights, because they recognize different weights in the menu by the number, not by the name. Because I could name this anything I want. I could call this mega bold or like really huge weight, you know? So, and it doesn't have to be, forget about the capitalization. So medium, now you'll notice that with regular it's 200, medium is 100. If I even start going backwards, it starts making this letter thin. But you have to be careful with what's called, this would be extrapolation. Weird stuff starts to happen in extrapolation. It's not necessarily the best thing to do. So what I would do is, for medium, what you're going to do is, because it's between 200 and 900, you can take, let's say, 300, and it's going to give me, watch what's happening with this n, it's giving me something about 100 units along the continuum after the 200 regular. Now I can add a new instance. Let's add a new instance and let's call it semi-bold. And we're going to actually say semi-bold, and I'm going to give semi-bold 500. That makes it quite bold. In fact, that starts to look to me more like a bold weight, but that's just the kind of space that we're dealing with. And then I'm going to make one that's called bold, and call out bold. And what was semi-bold? It was 500. Let's make this 700. That's bold. See how we're getting a bunch of steps? When a type designer typically will develop a static family that you guys are all used to working with, this is what it looks like. This is what the building of it would look like. Because imagine, otherwise I would literally have to draw each one of these characters. Because I can make another instance. I could make another one that I want to call extra bold. That could be at like 800 or even 750 if I wanted to have that kind of fine tuning. Now we're starting to get into an area where it's like, I don't necessarily need something between these two because then they do have access. But now watch what happens if I go back to font, variable font origin. It has to be, oh, that corresponds to masters, so this is different than instances. But let's go down here and let's go to, notice what's happened once I get some masters and I get some instances. I get a little dialog area here that I can click, and it pops up and it shows me my different instances. What I want to do though is I just want to show you something. We're going to go and we're just looking at the preview. We're going to say show all instances. Awesome. So we drew these two characters at once, and look at all the stuff that we got. Now I will say that when I tend to draw typefaces now, not just variable fonts, which I tend to really only develop variable fonts now, because I can export a variable font as a static font, as you can see, very easily if I want to. Now if I export this font in InDesign, the font menu is going to show me regular, medium, semi-bold, bold, extra bold, and ultra bold, corresponding to the names that I gave it in here. So in InDesign it doesn't recognize variable fonts, but if I'm in a web browser as well, and it can have a font menu, I would recognize these things too. In CSS though, you're not going to refer to a variable font in this way. You're going to use a unit value between 100, or sorry, between let's say 200 and 900 in the CSS. That's how you would actually refer to that. But when I'm drawing a letter form, what I do, I'm just going to put a random character, but I'm going to draw something here. Here's another technique for drawing, by the way, that you'll see inadvertently. Whoops, nope, break that. When I'm drawing, when I'm drawing a new typeface, I draw the masters all at the same time, especially something as simple as between bold and light. So for instance, what I would do is I would have these guys, And this is the rough shape of an N. Now here's, I'm just doing this because this is a super quick way to get a quick letter. Filter, offset curve. Okay, now make stroke. Oh, pretty cool. I'm going to make it pretty thin. And we'll do some interpolation stuff between this one too. Okay, so I'll fix this up quickly. Get a decent looking letter here. I'm not going to do all the crazy refining though, because this is just a demo for now, and this needs to taper. Notice one trick about drawing letters, especially sans. You need to taper stuff that you want to be monolinear. Still has to taper as it meets these strokes, or else it'll look too heavy. That's a little sans serif, but even a serif trick. All right, now let's just give this something like that, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste this, and I'll draw the bold. I will be working on I'll have a workflow like this. So even with this font, when I drew the A, I drew the light one, I drew the ultra bold one, then I decided I needed a bold one, so I drew that, and I drew this condensed version and the extended version. I draw them all together. Because actually, once you've built the parts, look at how easy it is to just work with the curves that you have. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2. So 7 on either side. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Once again, just getting something quick here. Oops. When you want to go fast, it always messes up. Okay. Same kind of idea as the last bold you saw me draw. But notice how it's easy to work with this because I'm starting from the same, I've got the math already built. I'm just using it to draw the bold version. So actually it doesn't take as long as you might think to develop the different masters because you already have the data. And in fact, I find that it's smarter, or that not necessarily smarter, but the way I like to think about it is it's more time efficient to actually draw the masters together, because then I can start making tests of the design space faster. Okay, now notice something here. This is really where we want to start looking. Look at some of this stuff happening here. That doesn't look very good. It's kind of a weird thing. And I'm going to change these values here between the masters. I'm going to call this thin right now. And I'm going to call this, leave it as ultra bold. But what I want is I need a new master. I'm going to duplicate this master. And I'm going to put a master as regular. This is where we're going to start modifying the design space so that it works more continuously, because what I see going on in here doesn't work very well. I don't like that very much. And in the instances, you're seeing something funny happening because it doesn't recognize, it doesn't have a master name for these guys. Thin. Yeah, it's changing things up a little bit, actually, is what it's doing, and it's using that N. Sorry, just give me a second. It is not liking. Oh, we don't have anything at 400. Okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to change these values around. I'm going to get rid of this one, and this is going to become 400. Medium is going to become 500. This will become, actually, you know what? This will be 500. Medium usually isn't so heavy, actually, so 450. Bold can stay as 700. Yeah. Okay. In fact, why don't we do this? All right. And now what we're going to do is I'm going to add a new instance for thin. Call it thin. And leave it at 200. And add another instance, and I can call that one, oh, did it add an instance? Yeah. And I want to call it light or something like that, and I'm going to give it a value of 300, so it's a step after that. And it's doing some weird stuff right now at this end because we don't have the same values built right now with this end that I drew in a different glyph. Okay, now let's reload that. Doing something funny. Okay. I've added an extra master, but the regular, we haven't drawn this one. Okay. Now what I can do to get a regular master is I can just expand it the way I did the bolds. And I don't want that extra master that it added. That's too much. Okay, so 1, 2, 3. And 1, 2, 3. And so the problem that's happening is that this section in here, the light section, because it gets so thin, let's get rid of this one, and what am I in the P? Because it gets so thinned out in here compared to the light, this is monolinear, this cannot be monolinear, this will be too heavy. So then I end up with something like this, and I end up with something funny in between. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to draw the regular version of the end the way I would want it to be with a more monolinear shape. Watch what happens in the interpolation space to these characters and these characters. So it's all changing in real time because I've got the math set up. And what's this? 46, 46. That should be a little bit lighter. This should come down, and this is going to come over a little bit. And it still needs to taper a little bit, but it should be a little bit smoother of a progression than this. Okay, for the sake of demonstration, there we go. Okay. Okay, so now what you see down here is the regular, which is occurring right here. This is medium, semi-bold, bold. Notice how it fades. This part fades, but it's a better progression because I'm controlling how this looks. Now something that I could do is I could say for regular, actually I want that regular to occur, I don't want it to happen so quickly. I want actually things to not migrate so quickly. So I could actually put this at 500. Then I would have to change my instances later on. So I would have to go in here and actually change how that occurs. But I can actually manipulate how the interpolation is behaving. Notice how this got a little bit heavier in here. So it's a smoother progression. There's another trick that we can use, and I'm going to actually do another video that is talking about more about how do you manipulate the interpolation space for a variable font. This is just to get you started with the idea of how do you draw your different masters, how do you work with interpolation in a very basic level. Then we'll start talking about working with interpolation more specifically for a variable font. How do we fine-tune these this axis behavior more? Okay, so I'll